I guess I can give a little bit of context. I'm going to be moderating today. Welcome everybody. We may have folks kind of trickle in as we get started here, but yeah, my name is Vishal. I'm a member of SPC. I'm very happy to be moderating this sort of fireside chat with Pete Koomen, who's here as well. He's the co-founder CTO of Optimizely, which I'm sure many of y'all know and kind of have familiarity with that. It was started in 2010 and has had an amazing journey. They eventually reached 100 million in ARR and were eventually acquired, I guess, what was it, last year, I think. And so, you know, I would love to actually talk to Pete about his journey there. He's actually gonna share some slides with us to give us the early story of the Optimizely days. And I always love to learn from entrepreneurs about what they learned along the way. And I think we'll talk about some of that stuff too. And kind of his thoughts on entrepreneurship and being a founder and stuff like that. If we have time, you know, we'll get to some maybe kind of personal stuff, get to know Pete a little bit better. You know, we're gonna kind of mix up the format here a little bit. We're gonna start with maybe 15 to 20 minutes of Pete walking through his slides about the story. And what I thought we would try is if y'all have questions, post them in the chat. I assume that you'll have permissions to do so. And I'm gonna try to take about 5-10 minutes in the middle of this hour to take some of the questions from the chat, and I will, you know, ask Pete from things that you post in there, and then, you know, keep posting questions in there, and we'll try to do that at the end too. Take another 10 minutes at the end for Q&A from you all, and I will kind of, you know, fill in the rest. So with that, let's get started. Thank you, Pete, and welcome.
Thank you so much. I will. I'll start by sharing my screen here. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So first, I'll apologize to the folks in the audience who used to work at Optimizely, because I'm sure a lot of this is going to feel pretty redundant. But I'm going to start with just a quick overview of where Optimizely came from, how we got started, and just a very brief summary of the last 11 or so years. And the story, let's see, there we go. The story starts at Google in 2006. So I grew up in upstate New York, and after college and then grad school moved out west and got a job at Google. This was my dream job at the time, and I was a young product manager there in 2006, and that's where I met my future co-founder, Dan Soroker. And he and I bonded pretty quickly just over a shared excitement about building stuff and entrepreneurship. And we made plans actually the next year to leave the company and to start our own thing. We didn't know what we wanted to do yet. We just knew we wanted to do something. And all of that actually got derailed when this happened. So this is then Senator Barack Obama, who came and spoke at the Google campus in late 2007. This was his first presidential campaign, early on in the campaign. And he did like a fireside chat with then Google CEO Eric Schmidt. And Dan and I had pretty different reactions. We both went to see this. And I remember seeing it and kind of thinking like, well, this guy's clearly got potential. And Dan, I think, just had a much more extreme reaction. He quit his job at Google 3 weeks later. He moved to Chicago. And he slept on a friend's floor, and he became part of the campaign. So he became the director of what was called New Media Analytics at the time. So this is his team at the Obama campaign. And he jokes that they gave they basically assigned the new media label to anything they didn't really understand. Right. And so there was the kind of the traditional campaign, and then off in the corner was the new media team. And that team was responsible for a lot of the internet outreach, social media, advertising, email, and all this stuff like that. And it's kind of funny to think of a time when that was kind of the weird new thing on the political scene. It was, the idea of using social media to help win a campaign was very new. at the time. And, of course, Dan brought a whole bunch of experience that he had over at Google, where a lot of the things that I think many of us would take for granted, it was in the drinking water at Google, but it was very new in the world of politics. And one of the practices that he brought from the Bay Area to this campaign was the process of A/B testing, of running experiments to empirically determine what designs and what copy, what messaging was most effective. It was also very new in a political context. And just to get us all grounded, I'm going to give an example of one of the experiments that they ran on the campaign. So this particular experiment involved the homepage, barackobama.com. And the experiment was focused on which piece of media would be included kind of on this splash page on barackobama.com. So the campaign had come up with several different potential designs, and they wanted to use an A/B test to determine which of these was most effective. And the first step here was they actually had to rigorously define what most effective meant. So they needed a metric to attach to this experiment. And they wanted that metric to capture the effectiveness of their design. And so I'm going to try to make this interactive. Does anybody want to guess what metric they used to measure the effectiveness of each design? Just looking at this page. Not a rhetorical question.
Looks like we have a couple guesses for signups.
Signups, yeah. Oh, I guess people can't by default talk here. Or maybe they can. Please, if you've got a question or suggestion in the future, I'm going to ask a couple more of these. Please just unmute your mic and say something. But yes, so the sign up button, right? It's a pretty obvious component of this page is this bright red sign up button, and it stands to reason that if you're trying to measure the effectiveness of a page, you'd focus on that button. Right. And so the metric they chose was just the percentage of visitors who landed on this page and pressed the sign up button. And we should mention why that was important, right? So when you click this sign up button, you needed to have filled out this email address form and the zip code form. And when you press that button, your email address and zip code would get logged in a giant registry. And that was important for the campaign because that giant registry is thousands, or in that case, probably millions of email addresses you could spam for donations. And it's millions of email addresses you could spam for volunteering opportunities. And specifically, the volunteering opportunities in this case often involved going out on election day, before election day, and knocking on doors and asking people whether they plan to vote and what their voting plan was. So it turns out this is a really big part of political campaigns. It's called the ground game. And it's mobilizing your voter base, right? So this turns out this is really, really important, right? Getting as much of these email addresses as possible is pretty pivotal in winning a campaign like this. And so they decided that was going to be the measure of effectiveness for this page, and they tried 6 different designs. And I'm going to walk through each of these designs, and I'm going to ask the audience here what you all think when I've shown all 6. And some of these have sound, and so I'm going to unplug my mic. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Great. So I'm going to walk through these. So the first is the get involved image. The second is the change image, the family image rather. The third is the change image. Then the next 3 are videos. So I'm going to hold up the microphone here.
Hi, I'm Barack Obama. Welcome to barackobama.com, the official website of my campaign for president. Here you can sign up for invitations to campaign events and learn more about our movement for change.
So kind of talking head candidate image or video. And then we have the Springfield video. I think these are clips from a rally in Springfield.
It's been a long time since I wanted to hear what a politician had to say.
You came here because you believe in what this country can be.
Oh, well, that's the end of the clip. And then the last one is a spliced together video from I believe it's the candidate's acceptance speech at the DNC, the Democratic National Convention, in 2007 when he accepted the nomination.
Now, even as we speak, there are those who are preparing to divide us. The spin masters, the negative ad peddlers, who embrace the politics of anything goes. Well, I say to them tonight, there is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America. There is not a Black America and a white America and Latino America and Asian America. There's the United States of America. The pundits like to.
So it's a famous speech the candidate gave. So I've got all 6 of these treatments in front of us here. And I want to poll the audience here. Which of these treatments do we think was most effective in terms of our learn more clicks? I can't see the chat.
I'm going to say Sam's video.
Sam's video. Why do you think that?
Why do I think that? I don't know. That seemed to be the most like heartstrings tugging video.
Yeah, it's got the kind of the swelling inspirational music in the background.
Yeah.
It's a great speech. Any other guesses here?
I think
Looks like we have a bunch of other guesses in the chat, like number 6, which I guess is Sam's video, Springfield, a bunch for change. I voted for the change one, family, a couple for family too.
Yeah, I think video might just take too much of people's time, so they'll get distracted and not sign up. So I think if it's an image and not a video, it's better. So you're looking at the top, I would guess the change one on the top right.
Okay, so on one hand, we have the fact that the video, it's just there's a lot of emotional content in there. It's maybe very inspiring. On the other hand, maybe it's distracting. I mean, you could come up with a couple arguments for maybe why either of these might be a reasonable choice. I heard several votes for the images. Is anybody able to, like, are there enough data points in the chat to get any kind of, is there a winner emerging in the chat? I'm sorry, I can't see the chat. So
It looks like it's change right now as a winner. We have about
the
5
change.
votes for that so far, 6 maybe.
Okay. So it turns out when this experiment was run, and maybe I should explain, what does it mean to run an experiment here? I never actually explained that. So I'm sure this is something most of you will be familiar with, but an A/B test, or an experiment in this case, is run by essentially flipping a coin each time a visitor lands on this web page and displaying one of these 6 treatments randomly, right? And so that allows you to control for all of the other variables over time that might impact the performance of your audience, and to measure which of these over some period of time will result in a higher percentage of clicks on that learn more button. So you're essentially using the live audience of the website to improve the site. You're collecting data and you're using that data to improve the performance of the page. And it turns out that when you looked at how actual humans were behaving when you displayed these 6, the family image. Go ahead. Oops. So the family image was the most effective. And I'm sure we could spend quite a while trying to figure out why was the family image more effective than maybe some of the other images or the videos. But I actually don't think that's the most interesting thing about this example. I think the most interesting thing about the example is that the team, the campaign team, actually ran an internal poll before they ran this experiment. So they asked all of the members of the campaign to vote on which of these treatments they thought would be the most effective. And in the internal poll, all 3 of the videos outperformed all 3 of the images. And when they ran the experiment, when they collected data from actual visitors to this website, all 3 of the images outperformed all 3 of the videos. Does anybody want to? So clearly the campaign staff got it very wrong, right? And if the staff had been left in charge of making this decision, there's a good chance they would have gotten it very wrong. Why do you think the staff got it so wrong? I mean, this is their job.
Maybe is the staff really young and do they not have families or of their own? And so maybe it didn't trigger something in them.
It's probably bias. The closer you are to something, you are much more willing to look more, watch more. You actually enjoy spending time with the video because you feel you're part of the same mission. While when you come from outside, you go to a super basic human connection, which is, yeah, probably family.
So I think these are really, really good guesses. Like, and they're different flavors of the same problem, which is that the campaign staff is not a representative sample of their audience, right? So maybe they trend young, right? Knowing how hard campaign staffers work, I would not be surprised if that were true. And maybe fewer of them have families. And so maybe the family kind of image just resonates a little less because they're at a different stage in life. Also to another point I heard there, like they've drunk the Kool-Aid, right? This is textbook preaching to the choir. And so the way that they react when they see one of these videos is probably going to be different on average than the way, the average visitor reacts. It's like, who's this Barack Obama guy I keep hearing about? It's going to be different from somebody who has, quit their job at Google and moved to, sleep on someone's living room in order to help out, right? So these are very, very different groups of people. I think there's another interesting piece of human psychology here, which I heard hinted at, which is like, it's very hard to be objective about something when you're close to it. Like, I bet these videos cost a lot more money and took a lot more time to create than the images. And there's this funny thing the human brain does is it uses the amount of effort you put into something as a heuristic for its value, which is rarely the case, right? So if I spend a whole bunch of time on a video and I spend 10 minutes on an image, my own brain is going to be biased towards that video just because I poured more of myself into it. And so, I don't know, it's a funny example of how hard it is to make good decisions about something when you're close to it, good creative decisions, which is so ironic. And it's to me, this is a great example of why experimentation is so valuable, because it allows you to circumvent your own biases and to collect data on what your actual audience responds to.
This is a fascinating example. We have a couple of other guesses here in the chat. Like, the context of the delivery is substantially different between being asked to provide an opinion on an option versus an end user seeing this while surfing the web. Another guess is page load is more with videos versus images. Another is insider versus outsider perspectives. And one question that comes to mind for me is, we can kind of look at it from, we can experiment at like a high level, and we can like try to through that experimentation, we learn, okay, the family one is the one that wins. And we can kind of guess backwards, why is that the one that won? But we don't necessarily know that from the results we get from the experimentation unless we do some deeper kind of investigation. And from your perspective, how important is that? Is it important to understand why this one was the winner? Or does it not really matter? And you say, hey, it's the winner, and we kind of keep doubling down on this direction. You keep doing more experiments that are sort of adjacent to this.
Super, super good question. So I'll address the first part first, which is there's a whole host of other reasons why, not only the campaign staff might have gotten it so wrong, but why videos perform so poorly. And, a really big one there is page load time, page performance. Right. And it's quite possible that the campaign staff all had fast connections, whereas the average visitor might not have. This is a bias that even today, 12 years later, is just almost omnipresent in SaaS products, tech products, which is that the people building it are often on super fast connections and high performance, processors. And they don't suffer the same latency issues that many of their users do. And so they become blind to it, right? It's like it's very likely that played a role here. Your second point about, is it important to understand the why? You're right. The experiment doesn't give you a why. It's a data point, right? Or it's a collection of data points aggregated into a conclusion, which is like, this thing performed better over this period of time. That's all we know coming out of this. And so the chances are, if I now make this the design of the homepage, I'm going to do better, but I haven't learned anything about why that's true. And depending on, I guess depending on the context, it may be really important to understand that, so if you're a designer now on the team, on the Obama team, and you've gotten this data point, so what do you do with that? Well, You could kind of just like, okay, we're just going to stick as many family stuff, family memes into our assets as possible. Or you could ask more questions, and you could run follow-up experiments trying to tease out smaller and smaller differences. You could, with this insight, go out and talk to a bunch of voters and try to understand, right? Like the best experiments, we've always said, should inspire a lot of other questions, and that's another big piece of the power of experimentation. I always get kind of sad when I see, this is less common these days, but at least when we're getting started, a lot of the marketing, and we were guilty of this too, around A/B testing was like, hey, the blue button did better than the red button, which is like fundamentally, not only is that likely to be statistical noise, but like even if you understood the why, it's very unlikely that you could learn from that productively and improve your business based on it. The best experiments get at some question you have about your audience and give you an insightful data point that hopefully inspires more questions. So I'm going to move on. So this and through many other experiments ended up having an estimated cumulative impact in the tens of millions of dollars. And it's worth noting that this campaign broke every record in the book around online fundraising. At the time, it's hugely successful on this front. And one of the reasons was that the kind of rigor that this team brought to decision-making around collecting data and using that to inform the design and messaging and everything else. At this point, the campaign ended and Dan moved back to the Bay Area, and he and I started our first companies. This is when I left my job, and we started working together formally. And our first company actually had nothing to do with any of that. It was a company called Carrot Sticks. It was an online math game for young kids where you could kind of create an avatar and then use carrot sticks to solve math problems in real time. And this was a lot of fun. We learned an awful lot, hard lessons in this one. It took about 9 months for us to figure out that this probably wasn't going to turn into a gigantic business. We had a lot of fun. We made almost no money. This is the head-to-head mode, so you could do real-time competition with other kids in your class. But about 9 months in, it was becoming clear that this really probably wasn't the right direction for us. So lots more to unpack there if we want to talk about it later. But at this point, we moved on to our next idea, and we applied to Y Combinator. And I'm going to assume everybody here is familiar with Y Combinator. I just want to explain what that is. But I've included our application video. And in that application video, we explain our second idea. So here it is.
Hi, I'm Pete. And I'm Dan. We're both former product managers at Google and studied a bunch of computer science stuff. And now doing a startup here in San Francisco called Carrot Sticks. So we started working on Carrot Sticks about 4 or 5 months ago. And the biggest problem that we ran into was distribution. So getting people to use the software, getting people to talk about the software with their friends. And so we started thinking very hard about that problem and how we would try to solve it. We came up with an idea that we're calling Spreadly. Spreadly is very simply a discount a merchant can give to a customer if that customer is willing to tell their friends through Twitter, through Facebook, through email about the product that they just bought. Today it's live on Carrot Sticks. You can buy a subscription to Carrot Sticks, and if you do that, you can get a discount if you tell your friends. And so the kicker is that discount is based on our estimate of your online influence. And so we're looking across various different social networks, maybe even blogs at some point, and other ways of interacting online. And we try to estimate the customer's influence with other people online. And based on that influence, we can calculate a discount that customer should receive.
So I don't know if that was clear. I'll explain it again pretty briefly. But before I do, if you ever want a very concrete metric for how difficult startups are, look at my hair density in this photo versus my hair density now. So the idea here for our second idea is called Spreadly. And basically, we just kind of looked over the last 9 months building Carrot Sticks, and we kind of realized, well, as software engineers, like building the product was kind of the fun and easy part, but getting people to use it was the hard part, distribution. And I bet we're not the only people with this problem. Let's try and solve that. So this is our second idea. And the idea was, it's a little widget you could put on your website that says, hey, if you want 5% off of your next purchase, then tweet about us and you can have it. So essentially, like, try to get your customers to do your marketing for you. And this is one of these ideas that sounds great on paper and turns out to be not very good in real life. Sounds great on paper because, well, it's solving a valuable problem, right? Or it's trying to solve a valuable problem. And at the time, the Twitter API was brand new and very hot. And after we applied and got into Y Combinator, we pretty quickly built a prototype of this and got a few early customers. And it just turns out that very few people are willing to spam all of their friends in exchange for a 5% discount, right? So this is kind of fundamental piece of human understanding we didn't really have when we had the idea, and that emerged as soon as we tested it. And so by the time Y Combinator started, I think maybe the first or second week, it was already becoming clear that this was maybe also not going to pan out the way that we wanted it to. And this was the point where Dan kind of went, like, we're a year in, we haven't really found anything that works. Going back to the campaign, this A/B testing thing was really powerful. And it turns out that's not common outside of Google. I wonder if we can make this easier, right? One of the reasons the hypothesis was that was not common was because it was so difficult to do. And so maybe we can change that by making it easier to do. And that's where Optimizely came from. So this was an early version of our website, not the earliest. I think this is maybe from 2012 or 2013. But you can see our tagline already: A/B testing you'll actually use. So that was Optimizely's tagline. And
I remember that tagline. I remember being just really impressed with it. I was like, yeah, that's very relatable.
Yeah. I actually always thought that I always thought that was the most effective way to describe Optimizely. Yeah, it's a shame we didn't keep that up there longer, because it's just it's very direct. But I'm going to give a very brief demo of what we built. Remember, so what our hypothesis is that if you make A/B testing easier, more people will do it. And what we ended up building for that was, I'm going to show you the current version of this product, which is 11 years later. But we built a crude version of what I'm about to show you here, which is our visual editor, right? So up until this point, if you wanted to run an A/B test, whether you're using a homegrown or an open source or an off-the-shelf platform, you had to kind of tag everything on your website that you wanted to change or to measure. And so that meant that every time you ran an experiment, you had to deploy a new version of your site. And the dynamic that we saw inside of these organizations, it was always the marketing department who wanted to run the experiments, right? Marketing is responsible for getting folks in through the funnel. And it was the IT or engineering department that was always on the hook for running them. And so the marketing team would say, hey, we want to run any experiment. The IT team would say, like, shove off, we've got a long roadmap. You can't tell us what to do. And it would just never get done, right? And so this is what we built to try and address that issue. Oops, I'm going to zoom out of the way here. So using our visual editor, I can select anything on the site. And here I've selected, this is actually the South Park Commons website. So let's imagine we wanted to run an experiment to improve our conversion rate on South Park Commons. It allows me to select anything I want on the page and then just go in. So let's say I wanted to test a shorter version of this splash text. So I'm just going to chop off this. And now I have a variant of my page, which is maybe shorter and crisper. And maybe that performs worse. Maybe that performs better. Who knows? I'm going to save this change. And of course, we need to define what it means to perform better. And so let's imagine that we're trying to measure the click-through rate on the apply button, because at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do with this website. We're trying to attract new members. So I can track clicks on this element. So now in just a few minutes, using only my mouse and my keyboard, well, what else would I use? That was stupid. In just a few minutes, as a semi-technical or a non-technical person, I've created a variant of my homepage, and I've created an objective metric I can use to measure the effectiveness of that metric. And now with another button click or two, I can deploy this experiment live and test it on my actual traffic. So we took this process, which, up until that point took days or weeks, depending on how long your backlog was and your deploy cycle was. And we've turned it into something that you can do in just a few minutes, right? All of this depends on just having one static tag in the head of the page, and that tag you never actually have to change thereafter. So you've essentially you've removed the need for IT from the equation in theory. So that's Optimizely, and that's the product that we built back in 2010. So now I'm going to very quickly compress the next 11 years into a few slides. In 2013, we wrote a book together, A/B Testing, the most powerful way to turn clicks into customers. That was a weird experience. Great animations here. So over the next few years, we raised 3 rounds of equity funding. So I didn't mention this, but we raised an angel round in 2010 coming out of Y Combinator. That was it was on a note. Safe didn't exist then, but we raised it on a note. And then in 2013, we raised our first equity round led by Benchmark. In 2014, we raised another round by Andreessen. In 2016, another round, our Series C by Index. In 2016, we launched a product that instead of being aimed at kind of the non-technical marketer on a website, was aimed at enabling experimentation in any code base, right? So, no visual editor, but a set of SDKs that you could embed in a whole bunch of different code bases, in a whole bunch of SDKs in many different languages that you can embed in any code base. So you could run experiments in native mobile applications or server-side apps. Anywhere that you can run code, you should be able to use this product that we call Full Stack to run experiments. We, over the years, accumulated a lot of customers I'm super proud of. Just some of the logos on this site or on this slide: State Farm, Microsoft, Nike, eBay, Best Buy. Many of the most recognizable brands in the world used and still use Optimizely to experiment. And in 2020, last year in the fall, we were acquired by a content management company called Episerver. And then that company subsequently changed the name of the entire combined company to Optimizely. So Optimizely still exists and is now a much larger company. And that's it for my slides.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think that was a great way to kind of learn about your story and see everything from the very early days to kind of, fast forwarding to where we are today. I'll ask everyone in the audience, if you have questions that come up, feel free to stick them in the chat, and we'll definitely get to them. I would love Pete to kind of talk more about those early days. It was so fascinating to me, and I had learned a bit of this in my research before this, of the iterations that you did before Optimizely with Carrot Sticks and Spreadly. And the interesting thing is that they're just so different from what Optimizely ended up being. And so I think that's something that a lot of us here can relate to, is being in that phase of trying things out, exploring things, and you're going deep on some of those ideas. You're trying to commit to them, see if they're really going to work. Now you put in 6 months, you put in 9 months, you put in 12 months. You're having to change because it's not quite working the way you want. And I'm curious to get your perspective on how did you decide to make those changes? Because sometimes things are sort of working, and it's a gray area of, do I keep doubling down on this? And maybe like the magical corner is 2 months away and there's just a few more things that are left, or hey, it's really time for us to figure out something better here.
Yeah, that's such a good question. And it reminds me that a lot of times when you hear founding stories, they've sort of edited out all of these moments of existential crisis, which plague every founder, right? Everywhere, anytime. And so what I tried to do here was to include, maybe some of the twists and turns, where, to make it clear that we really had no idea what we were doing at the time. But even there, that was still an oversimplification, because when I say that we built this Carrot Sticks thing and then we pivoted to the second idea, and you mentioned, well, sometimes it's sort of working and sort of not. You're exactly right. And we actually didn't. It was not a hard pivot. We just sort of pivoted, and then we sort of pivot. So in both pivots for us, it was well, this is sort of working. So we're gonna keep this. We're gonna keep this in our back pocket. we'll keep the site up. Maybe we'll do a bit of work on it, and we'll just try this new thing. One of the things that really ultimately really pulled us towards Optimizely was that a year in, we were getting pretty desperate for anything that would work. And when Dan had the idea for Optimizely, we restrained ourselves. We refused to write any code for this idea until we could prove to ourselves that somebody would pay for it. And so we actually called up several of the agencies that worked with the Obama campaign and described what we were going to build and asked if they would pay $1,000 a month for early access to Optimizely before it existed. And 2 of them said yes. And so we actually earned more in that first day of Optimizely than we had the entire previous year for those other ideas. So that was maybe the first real concrete, hang your hat on it signal that we're finally on to something. And up until then, it was not as clearly defined as I made it sound like.
So you actually had your first customers before you had written a line of code of Optimizely.
That's right.
That's fascinating. And that was different, it sounds like, from your approach with the first 2.
It was
ideas
different.
where you built something first and then you try to get it out there and struggled with that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And actually we were always kind of oriented towards trying to validate by charging money. But how ruthless we were changed a lot over that year. And so that one of the metrics that you can chart for our journey was the time from inception of an idea to first dollar earned. And with Carrot Sticks, it was 5.5 months. And with Spreadly, it was 1.5 months. And with Optimizely, it was a day. And so that's it's a funny meta metric that maybe described our effectiveness in validating our ideas or our desperation, depending on the angle you want to look at it.
That's so interesting. And we have a kind of very relevant question here from Aiden to kind of double click on locking in those early pilot customers, which is what was that period like between getting the commitment from them, the verbal commitment, and then you having built out the MVP that actually delivered the value to them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we actually, the first versions of Optimizely, the thing I showed you that's obviously 11 years in, right? And it's quite polished. The first versions were really crude. And actually they were only really usable by Dan and me and later our early team members. So the first versions of our product were kind of not meant to be used off the shelf by anybody. That's how crude they were. But they were useful enough that they allowed us to kind of act like consultants for some of these early customers. So for Optimizely, the earliest customers that we had, we were just creating A/B tests for them. Which is a bit of a hack, right? It doesn't really validate that there's an independent product that you can sell and scale, but it does allow you to get much closer to the problem and understand how your hopefully your future customers think about it. What kind of hoops you need to jump through within their organizations to make things happen, and to we learned all sorts of interesting lessons through that period. It was only after we raised our first round of funding that we made the decision we're going to cut off all of the consulting revenue and we're going to force ourselves to build a product that somebody could use on their own without our help.
And that was a couple of years in, right? If I'm remembering correctly.
No, that was actually the first year.
Oh, that was the first year. Okay.
Yeah. So 2010, the first equity round that we raised was 2013, but we raised an angel round in 2010.
Gotcha.
And that allowed us to hire an early team.
Gotcha. Yeah, and so let's kind of talk more about those early days of Optimizely. So now you're kind of getting more momentum on it. You're getting sort of more commitments on it. In those very early days, think about the first year of Optimizely. What were some of the sort of surprising challenges that you faced? And given even the context that you had of iterating through a couple of ideas before that, but even then, kind of what sort of surprised you in those early days, and kind of relatedly, kind of what, when you're running a startup, some of those things aren't worth worrying about in retrospect, and some of them are totally worth worrying about, and they're totally worth kind of focusing on. And kind of how does, looking back on it now, like what were some of those early challenges and those early worries that you had that, you know, you kind of worked through and learned that, hey, like this was really important, and what were some of those things where like, hey, we actually didn't need to worry about this so much as we did.
Sure. Super good questions. I'll answer the second one first, because like when I go back to the earliest days of all of this, you know, the biggest stressor, the biggest challenge I faced was just managing my own psychology as a founder, which was both a surprise and also something in retrospect that I wish I hadn't spent so much time stressing about. And I, you know, like from my background, it was just like very much drilled into my head, like save, and be very like financially conservative. And I'll tell you, like leaving my job and then watching my bank balance go down over the course of a year, it was incredibly stressful. And you know, like many people in a situation like this, like both Dan and I had many other options, right, and potentially many other lucrative options. And staying at Google was one of those things. And so I, for a long time, you know, it was like would stress out about like, did I make the right decision for my career? You know, did I, especially as we were like failing over and over again. And you imagine, you know, what else you could be spending your time on. And and that was really hard. Like I didn't expect to worry that much about that. When I quit my job, I was like all like super gung ho and like, hell yeah, like let's crush this. And really surprised at how much of my stress during those early days just came from my own like financial insecurity, my own sense of like, well, maybe we're not as good as we thought we were, which it turns out was true. We're not as good as we thought we were. And one of the tactics that I ended up adopting, I don't know if this really solved the problem, but I picked a date, and I sat down, I did some back of the napkin math, and I picked a date and said like, you know, hell or high water, I should be fine at least until like August or next year, you know, whatever date that was. And I'm just going to try to not think about this until then. I'm going to acknowledge like, this is something that stresses me out, but I'm just going to, you know, I'm in this to win it, like no matter what, until at least this date. I'm not going to ask myself this existential question until then. So I wish I hadn't spent so much time worrying about that, but I also realized like, it's just part of my personality, part of my nature. And I think it's pretty common. And then you asked about like, what are other some like surprising things that we struggle with early on? I think one of the things that coming from a bigger company is a real surprise. It was definitely a surprise to us, but is to many other founders, is how hard hiring is. Like I, you know, at Google, I literally sat in hundreds of job interviews for other product managers. And, you know, like, so after hundreds of job interviews, you get really good at like asking these like stupid gotcha questions, you know, and there's all these like classical Google interview stories. And coming out of that, I was like, yeah, I pretty much have hiring figured out. Like I know how this works. And of course, what I didn't appreciate at all was that like Google has like a, you know, just this like constant river of resumes, you know, inflowing, right? And so the hardest thing about hiring when you're at Google, at least at the time, was like filtering through all these resumes and trying to find the good one. And of course, like at a start, there are no resumes. Like nobody's knocking on your door. And you actually, the challenge as a founder is you need to, if you find somebody that you think is amazing, you actually have to convince them not only to take a bet on you know, this thing you're building, but to say no to every other lucrative opportunity that they have on their plate. So it's one of these many examples of this, but it's like, you know, you work at a big company, the big company has solved a problem so well that as an employee, you don't even appreciate that the problem exists. And then when you switch to founding a company, suddenly all of these problems have to be solved from scratch. And it's a rude awakening.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. And by the way, thank you for kind of sharing your story about the kind of financial stress that you had. I think that that's something that a lot of founders, you know, go through, but it's less talked about. But yeah, I can definitely relate to kind of hiring as a challenge at the early stage. And something that comes to mind is sort of converse of that, is that the things that you spend a lot of time at, and focus on at a big company and were important at a big company aren't that important often at at the early stage. Like the typical one for an engineer is premature scaling, right? Or kind of this generally premature optimization. And so how do you kind of unlearn those things and learn what to focus on?
Yeah. A lot of the problems at big companies fall into the category of good problems to have, right? Like you should be so lucky to have to filter through a stream of resume.
And now I imagine it's as optimizely scaled up, and this is kind of another thing that I'd like to talk about, and we do have a question in the chat here that's relevant, is sort of, you turned from this early stage startup into this bigger organization, and I imagine there was a whole host of challenges there. I'm curious about your personal perspective on kind of how did your role as founder CTO change during that time? And kind of looking back on it, are there things that you say, hey, I wish I kind of done this differently? I'm just curious to kind of learn more about your experience there.
Yeah, the answer is absolutely yes. So actually, just to clarify, this is a good lead in, I think. So my title when, as of kind of the end of the run last year was just co-founder. And that title changed several times over the years. So when we started the company, I was like, my title was president. And then about 5 years in, I switched to CTO. And then shortly before we were acquired, I dropped the CTO and was just co-founder.
Okay.
And kind of along those lines, my role evolved quite a bit as the company grew. And this was actually something that I struggled quite a bit with. Like I got a lot of energy from those early days, from the creativity, just the frenetic energy. And what I learned, sometimes much later than I should have learned, is that as the company grows, so much more of the job has to do with engineering the organization than it does engineering, the product itself, right? And so much more of what you spend your day-to-day time on is like the communication pathways within an organization and resolving disputes, and the nature of the work changes very much over those years. And especially early on, we kind of went through this hyper growth phase. And as a founder, you're basically like just doing everything you can to hang on, right? To learn and to grow personally as quickly as you can to meet the demands of this organization. And I think one of the things I struggled with early on was going from kind of being an individual contributor very early on to managing a very large team of people, finding myself in a role that, A, I really didn't enjoy all that much, and B, I definitely was not ready for at the time. And kind of realizing that, I guess the thing that I wish that I had kind of spent more time thinking about as a founder was being proactive about focusing my time on the intersection of what the company needs and what I'm kind of uniquely good at and what I enjoy doing. And I think the reason that it took me quite a while to figure that out, I've heard this from a lot of other founders too, is that when you start a company, you basically have one job. It's like, do whatever needs to get done. Like if you don't do it, it's not going to happen. And so you kind of adopt this mentality of like, what I want doesn't matter. Like basically it's whatever needs to be done at any given moment in time. That's my job. That's the highest use of my time. And when you start to become successful, at some point, you get the luxury of being able to ask, well, what do I want to do? But it's kind of hard to, it's not always obvious when that point comes in a startup, even though it's very common for founders to go through this. And so I think if I were to start another company, kind of my role and my trajectory through the growth of the company, if we were successful, is something that I would spend more time proactively thinking about.
That's so interesting. And so you kind of felt like the growth of the company took that away from you, and you kind of let it dictate how your role evolved, where you would want to be more thoughtful about that and kind of be more sort of structured about, hey, this is what I really want to hear, the sort of boundaries on my role, and delegate other things. Very
much so. Yeah. I mean, and actually there's all sorts of maybe important lessons to draw from this, but as a founder, one of the really important things that is also so easy to discount is just the importance of kind of self-care and finding like a sustainable approach to work.
Mm-hmm.
Again, that's kind of a luxury, and it's not something you really get to think about early on. But, I think 5 years or so in, 4 or 5 years in, I reached a point where I was like maybe the most unhappy I've ever been. And, between basically like hating my job, some really fundamental disagreements with my co-founder, kind of got to the point where I was like, I'm out. Like, I don't want to do this anymore. And I actually left. We decided to kind of like, let's not make any decisions in that moment. I left on a sabbatical. I took 3 months, which is amazing. And I came back in a different role. And it took a while to kind of find my footing within the organization after that point. But that was really useful. It was really useful for me personally. And that kind of is something like, rather than kind of let it get to this point where I'm like hating every moment, I wish that I had been much more thoughtful, and would in the future, I think, try to be much more thoughtful about spending my time where I get energy from it.
I mean, it's great that you were able to figure that out, and you were able to come back after that hiatus and figure out a role that allowed you, it sounds like allowed you to stay on another 5 years after that, right?
Yeah, I did. I'm actually still employed. I'm still consulting part-time for the parent organization, although I don't think that's going to last for too long. Okay.
Kind of a related question on this topic of kind of roles and stuff is from Julian here in the chat, which is, he kind of mentions it's great to see that you as a kind of co-founder are doing product demos still after 10 plus years. And how did you think about stepping away from the product, and knowing that you've held a bunch of titles, but I imagine have had a huge influence on the product? And how do you think about stepping away from the product in particular and hiring someone to take over that, like a VP of a product?
Another really, really good question. And I feel like this could be like, you could ask that same question about almost any aspect of the business. Like, how do you feel about stepping away from this? And these are some of these questions I still really don't know, even in retrospect, if we made the right calls on them. One of the things that makes the founding job hard, and what I mentioned before, you're just kind of like struggling to hold on, is through growth, is this notion that your job as a founder for quite a while during the scaling phase is like, come up against some problem you have no idea how to solve, do your best to like understand the problem and get to a point where you can come up with a reasonable solution for it, and then fire yourself and hire someone who can do it better than you. And it's like that, like, rinse and repeat over and over and over again, basically. Like, so you're kind of always like cycling between like being like okay at something and then sucking at something, which is kind of demoralizing. But when it comes to product, like stepping away from it, so like the earliest kind of way that this manifested was we stopped writing code. Both Dan and I stopped writing code. And I stopped writing code when I noticed that like my life was sufficiently interrupt driven that I was like becoming a bottleneck, because coding in a group is a very collaborative exercise. Everybody has dependencies on other people. And as soon as you're like, can no longer reliably devote big chunks of time to this, like you start holding everybody back. And I've always missed that. Like I always got a lot of energy out of that kind of, I just like coding a lot. Over the years, as we had more and more people, like hired a lot of smart people who were much better than we were at a lot of these things. We hired, product managers, and then a director or VP of product first, and then eventually an amazing CPO named Claire who ran the product team. And I think one of the things looking back on all of that I think I would think harder about next time is like, what is the way that you can create for, the founders, for Dan and me to kind of continue playing a directional role in product, while maybe sort of leaving the administration of the product organization to somebody who's far more capable. And maybe part of that maybe is just selfishly because I just really love product, right? But I also think that, looking back, I think some of the decisions that we made were driven by what we thought were the right things for going enterprise, or what we thought were the right things for growing and scaling a large company, which I don't really think in retrospect were as important as we thought they were at the time. And, it's always funny. It's like the decisions that you kind of spend the most time thinking about afterwards are the ones where you went against your gut. It's like the ones where you're wrong, you're just wrong. And you're like, okay, well, It's the ones that where you went against your gut that you end up kind of playing over and over in your head. I think product is an area that I would try as a founder to stay close to as long as possible.
That's great. So, I mean, being mindful of time here, we have a couple of minutes left. I wanted to kind of ask something that's going to come to mind that, as we kind of talk to and learn from an experienced entrepreneur like yourself, there's a lot of kind of learnings that I think people can take away from it. And I think if you take a broader view at the entrepreneurial ecosystem as a whole, there's a bunch of learnings that a bunch of people have from their experiences. And there's a lot of different advice that you get. There's a lot of different frameworks to think about. This is the right way to start a company, and this is not the right way. And I think one of the challenges that I see early stage founders have is, how do you filter and interpret all of this kind of advice around entrepreneurship that sometimes can be contradictory?
That's a really good question. Speak off the cuff here. I guess like one of the one of the experiences that I've had consistently since the beginning of Optimizely is like encountering somebody that I thought was like intimidatingly amazing, and then realizing sometime later that like actually they were just kind of winging it like everybody else.
Right.
And there were so many things where like hearing something and kind of taking it as gospel, and then realizing later on like, oh, it turns out that was bullshit. So I have a pretty like cynical view about advice, especially my own advice, to be totally honest. When I look back at advice we got, the piece of advice that really stuck the longest were really how to manage your emotions, situation specific, and for the most part ignorable. It was almost always the kind of meta advice, like how should I think about problems, or how should I think about a class of problems, right? So that given my context that nobody else has, I can make the best decision possible. So yeah, that's the advice that if I'm on that end of it, I try to give, and then on the receiving end, what I try to extract from it, can I emulate rather than the specific decisions that they.
So much more I think that we could drill into here about what you've learned and kind of what you've learned about how to think. And I would love to kind of continue that. We are at time, and so I will take this opportunity to thank you, Pete, for joining and sharing your story. This was great. This is just a really fascinating kind of look into your story, and thank you all for joining that are here in the call. And yeah,
cheers. It's an honor to be here. Thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you for your thoughtful questions. Shout out to the former Optonauts on the call. They were responsible for most of the good things that happened with that company. And I'm on the Slack group. Just send me a note if you want to chat. I'm always happy to.
Cool. Awesome. All right. Take care. Thank you all.
Thank you, Vishal. Thank you, Pete.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you.